Okay, so this is going to be the first episode of what I'm calling a reflection show. So the idea of this episode is that it will not be a kind of standard narrative history with me, going through the story of whatever we're talking about with lots of sources and quotes and things like that. This show will be more of an opportunity to summarize and maybe reflect on some of the things that we've talked about in the episodes leading up to this. So some of those bigger themes and kind of those bigger historical ideas that can help us understand the nuance of history. And as I've been kind of reflecting and thinking about the episodes I've already put out, one of the major themes that has kind of come up is this idea of how do we judge history? So how do we make judgments about the past as far as what's right and what's wrong in a way that is fair, but also sticking to what is true and what actually happened. From my perspective, the number one mistake that people make when they are judging history is that they think about it in terms of good guys versus bad guys. And this kind of simple explanation gets applied to a lot of things in history, and this kind of leaves out a lot of room for some of the nuance and some of the things that actually make history more interesting. Now, I don't blame people for this because I think that not just in history, but in a lot of different realms, a lot of different theaters, people are brought up from a very young age to think about these things in terms of good guys versus bad guys. So think about children's literature for a second, okay? And especially, like the pop culture, popular stuff that people read at a young age. Okay, so think Lord of the Rings, think Harry Potter, Chronicles of Narnia, okay? All the stuff that kids would read or experience in the movie theater. Take the Lord of the Rings, for example. You have, the hobbits who are portrayed as the innocent, friendly, good people, and you have the Gandalfs dressed in white, and you have the heroic, members of the Fellowship of the Ring versus the orcs, kind of the monstrous guys who wear all black, and they, just seem like more monsters than anything else. Take Harry Potter. You have the good guys, the wizards, versus the bad guys who are called the Death Eaters. And there's really not a lot of room for nuance. The bad guys, the Death Eaters, seem to do things that are evil just because they can. They don't seem to have any long-term plan other than just go out and dominate things. And again, you see this kind of good guy versus bad guy dichotomy here. And you'd be able to find similar types of dualisms in Chronicles of Narnia or Hunger Games or whatever kind of young children's literature you want to look for. And I don't want to make the mistake of saying that there's not any nuance in these stories, because of course there is, and that's what makes these stories fantastic. And obviously I'm a huge fantasy guy, and I think all of those stories are excellent. But I wonder if a lot of that nuance isn't lost on people. So what I mean by that is that I think that pop culture and maybe even the media and maybe, whatever other forces are at play here kind of distills the essence of that nuanced story in order to fit a cookie cutter type archetype that is then distributed to the masses. So it's much easier to think about things as far as, the good guys are the wizards and the bad guys are the Death Eaters, as opposed to kind of going through all the nuance and having to read through the entire book. And, you might even have to reread a couple sections to make sure you understand. And now all of a sudden it becomes tedious to get the real version of the story. And just as a little aside here to continue our little popular literature analogy, to me this is why the book series A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin is so great in my eyes. So I'm talking about the books here and not the show, because I think the show is guilty of kind of taking what makes the books a little bit complex and kind of just distilling it down into a simplified version. So the books are not black and white. There is real people who change and evolve. Nobody remains static. Nobody is a cookie cutter type archetype. And people have real motivations, and it's difficult to figure out who to root for. And it seems to more accurately represent the real world. And to me, this kind of nuance is what makes those books attractive. And even that, you can see how the HBO show can take some of those nuanced plot lines and kind of just simplify them into a more easy to digest version for the popular masses. So let's go ahead and take this book, literature analogy and apply it to history. So I think that for a lot of reasons, and, for whatever reason that is, most people can't interact with the source fully enough. So, just think about those big, long Game of Thrones books. There's not enough time. The book's too long. There's only 24 hours in the day. We all got families and friends and things to do. So instead of going out and interacting with that story one-on-one, we have to rely on other people to give us the distilled version. Again, unless you actively go out and immerse yourself in the story, unless you actively go out and seek knowledge, then you're going to walk away with a version of the truth that is kind of accurate, but at the end of the day, it's not the full story. And ultimately, I wonder if the same thing doesn't happen in history. So people jumping to conclusions without the full story, without walking in the other guy's shoes for just a little bit, and then using that distilled version of history to make judgments about the world and about policies and about politics that impact real people. And to me, this is dangerous. And this really isn't anything earth-shattering or groundbreaking. I mean, you don't have to surf Twitter very long to see examples of people jumping to conclusions without the full story. I just think the same thing happens on a bigger scale in history, and at least the study of history, in ways that a lot of people really don't think about. So I wonder a lot if this theme of the average person just kind of accepting the easiest possible answer, is this related to some of the more popular studies of history? So to me, obviously, the most popular history topic for the average person is World War II. I think if you had some sort of futuristic search engine that compiled all of the history conversations that were happening throughout the world, I think most of them would be about World War II. And why is this? In my opinion, it's because there's moral clarity there. The Allies, the United States, Great Britain, these are the good guys, and the Nazis and the Axis powers, those are the bad guys. So this is a very easy to understand narrative. And obviously there's some nuance there, as we've discussed, in previous episodes, like our talk about how Nazi soldiers who committed these atrocities, that was episode 13, Ordinary Men. We talked about how there was kind of some nuance there. And we talked about how even the victims, it wasn't a one-sided narrative completely, if you go back to episode 3, Night, and listen to that one. There is obvious complexity and moral nuance even in something like World War II. But on the surface level, that kind of, interpretation of the Allies are the good guys, the Nazis are the bad guys, that's more or less correct. But I think the problem comes when Hollywood and the media and even your history teacher kind of distills that, complicated, nuanced narrative and just turns it into good guys and bad guys with no room for any sort of nuance or character analysis. To me, I think this is why World War II becomes so popular, because it's easier to understand on a surface level, and this allows it to become popular. You know what is not very well understood and what is not as popular as World War II? World War I. Now, I do know it has become more popular in recent years, but I would definitely still argue that it is not very well understood. I mean, you can pause this episode, or you can, pull up your text and you can go ask a friend to tell you some basic facts or themes about World War I. And I bet the answers you get will be comical. And why is that? Well, in my opinion, it's because there's kind of a murky nature to it. It's tough to separate the good guys and the bad guys, and it's tough to assign blame, and it's tough to say whose fault the whole thing was. So it becomes really tough for kind of that pop culture cookie cutter version of World War I to kind of become known. And it's tough to distill that down, and it becomes tough to understand unless you actively go out and make an attempt to analyze all of the different perspectives that are happening. Whereas with World War II, we can just kind of rely on Saving Private Ryan to, tell us what happened and who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. It's much more difficult for the media or for Hollywood or for your history teacher to kind of distill down World War I because it has that complicated moral nature to it. Again, I'm not arguing that World War I is more complicated than World War II, and that's why it's less understood. I'm arguing that it's more complicated from a moral perspective. You can't just simply say these are the good guys and these are the bad guys, even though some people do, and obviously they're wrong for doing that. But I think World War II is a lot more easy to kind of digest in moral terms, and this kind of allows it to be more easily dispersed through society and maybe even more popular for the average person. And of course, there's nothing wrong with this. I'm just trying to show that the way that we judge history and the way that we kind of have a certain lens to look at things through, this definitely impacts the modern world. I would also argue that this is why studying ancient Rome is so important and so poorly understood. And I think that people make an error all the time in comparing our time period now to the fall of the Roman Empire. I think the much better comparison is the fall of the Roman Republic. And obviously, much better podcasters than me have done very excellent series on just this. And, we attempted to do that with my series on the social war. I think that was episode 10, 11, and 12. And we kind of looked at all of the different factors that contributed to the decline of the Roman Republic. And we kind of saw how there was a lot of similarities between what's going on in the modern day and what was happening back then. And if you look at the stuff we did and the stuff that led up to those Roman civil wars, you can kind of see this mess of moral complication and murky moral gray area, which of course means that that era is going to be poorly understood, and it's going to be tough for kind of the quote-unquote masses to take any lessons from it. And that's why it's so important to study that period, because it's just so complicated as far as a moral perspective. It's very difficult to say who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. And as we did in our episodes there, I kind of tried to show how, both sides were right for a time, both sides were wrong for a time, and, both sides did good things, both sides did horribly evil things, and, the cycle of history continues. So basically all I'm really saying here is that looking at history through a lens of simply good guys versus bad guys, as I think a lot of people do, even if they don't know it, I think this is not a particularly useful and not particularly effective way of looking at the world. I think it would be superior to look at things more through a lens of nuance. Make sure we attempt to walk a mile in the other guy's shoes and attempt to understand real perspectives. This can allow us to make real judgments about history and about what is right and what is wrong. Just to be clear here, what I'm not arguing for is what's called moral relativism. And the idea of moral relativism or cultural relativism is that this idea that every culture is different, and therefore everyone has a different perspective, and therefore it is impossible to make any judgments about what is right and wrong because everyone's doing it differently, everyone grows up differently, everyone has a different perspective, and therefore it's tough to say what's right and wrong because it's all relative. To me, this is clearly false. Of course there are things that are clearly right and clearly wrong, and in particular, of course there are things that are clearly wrong and violations of an individual's basic human rights. So stuff like murdering innocent people, stuff like rape, stuff like sitting back and enjoying forcing intelligent creatures to suffer for no particular reason. I think that very few people would argue that these are good things and they should be accepted. So I think that if you try to argue that those things are good, from a moral relativist perspective, you would find a lot of faults in that argument. Clearly, there are certain things that are wrong, no matter what your culture is or no matter what your perspective is. So just because I'm saying that understanding other people's perspectives and respecting that moral nuance and gray area of morality, just because I'm saying that's important to make moral judgments, that does not mean I'm arguing for moral relativism. I think, as we've said before, understanding is not excusing, and understanding allows us to recognize what went wrong so we don't let it happen again. At the end of the day, how should we make judgments about the past? How should we judge history? I think some people like to say that we can't judge people from long time periods ago because the standards of the time were different. For example, we can't necessarily judge the slave ship captains from the times of the Middle Passage because it was just accepted behavior at the time. Slavery was commonplace, everybody did it, so you know what, let's move on. Or some people might argue that we can't make judgments about the past because of that idea of moral relativism we talked about. Everybody's different, and everyone has their own opinions about things, so let's just kind of move on. But what I'm saying here is that no, let's go ahead and call out those things that are clearly wrong and clearly evil, but we can also try to see it from the different perspectives involved and understand why they did the things they did. So to me, this is super important. Yes, we can call out things that are right and call out things that are wrong, but we should also make the effort to see it from their different perspectives and to understand why they did the things they did, whether they were good things or bad things. And that way we can prevent, or at least attempt to prevent, those horrible things from happening again. And isn't that the whole point of history? Okay, so that is me rambling on about judging history and moral relativism. Thank you for making it this far. As always, if you agreed with what I said, you can, or if you disagreed, you can shoot me an email, tweet me, whatever floats your boat. Go ahead and do that. If you're still listening to the podcast, and at this point it's probably the few and the brave, I would definitely encourage you leave a review on iTunes. That would help me out a whole bunch, and that would be super cool. But as always, thanks for listening, and see you next time.